In this lesson, we'll take a look at how to draw a realistic cupcake with colored pencils, and we'll also be using Neocolor 2 water-soluble wax pastels. For this demonstration, we'll be working on Canson Me Tots pastel paper. The paper has a heavily textured side and a less textured side. We'll be using the less textured side for this demonstration. I'll begin by drawing out the contours of our subject, which of course is a delicious cupcake with a cherry on top. I'm focusing in on only the basic shapes here at the beginning. We're not going to add any value or shading with the graphite. Instead, we'll develop all of that information with the colored pencils and water-soluble wax pastels. Once I've got the basic shapes in place, we'll go ahead and start creating base layers. We're going to start with the cherry, and we're going to develop the cherry completely. We'll start by using the Neocolor 2 water-soluble wax pastels. I'll lay down scarlet first with a little bit of black, and then I'll accentuate the highlights with some of the white. One of the great benefits of using these water-soluble wax pastels is, of course, they are water-soluble. So we can add water with a brush, and I'm using a very minimal amount of water here. But it activates the wax pastels and allows them to be moved on the surface. Essentially, what we're creating here is somewhat of an underpainting, and we'll be able to apply colored pencil applications over the top with a bit of color already in place. Now again, I'll stress that I'm using a minimal amount of water here. Remember, this is not watercolor paper. This means if heavy amounts of water are added, the paper will buckle. Once the surface is allowed to dry, we can go ahead and start applying colored pencil applications over the top. We'll start here with an application of Crimson Lake, and of course I'm using the Prismacolor Premier line of pencils. Then we can start to darken up the shadow that happens on the left side of the cherry by adding a bit of Tuscan Red over the top. We'll continue developing the light and dark values that happen on the cherry. Once we've got a good amount of Tuscan Red in the darker spots, we'll go back with a bit of Crimson Red and make the reds in the lighter areas a bit bolder and brighter. Then to darken the area of shadow a bit further, we'll use a combination of dark umber and indigo blue. This mixture produces a more natural looking black than black alone. Black is such a strong color that it can make some areas appear flat and unnatural if you're not careful, so it's usually better to mix your own black. We can burnish applications in between using a colorless blender before going back and making the highlights and lighter values a bit stronger by adding a couple of applications of white. We'll develop some of the details and subtle reflections that happen on the lower portion of the cherry. And in this case, we have two light sources. One light source from the right, which is a bit stronger, and a secondary light source that's coming from the left, which is a bit weaker. This means that we'll have highlighted areas on both the left and right side of the cherry. To make the cherry feel a bit more natural, we'll add just a bit of red purple. In this case, the color I'm using is mulberry, and then we'll go back with the colorless blender, smoothing transitions of value and color. There is a slight shadow that happens on the very top of the cherry, and of course this is produced by the stem, so we'll use a bit of Tuscan Red here and then burnish it using the colorless blender. We'll add a few more subtle areas of darker value using the Tuscan Red. And then to make the strong highlight in the center portion of the cherry a bit stronger, we'll use the white from the Neocolor 2 set, and we won't activate it at all with water, we'll just allow it to sit on the surface. Then a few more areas of highlight and detail are added using the white colored pencil. Now we'll move on to the stem for now. We may revisit the cherry in the future. Again, we'll reach for our Neocolor 2 water-soluble wax pastel and add an application of yellow-green, and then activate it using a bit of water. Now we'll concentrate on developing the shadowed areas of the stem using apple green. We can make that quite a bit darker by applying dark umber over the top. We'll add a bit of variety to the color and give it more of a natural appearance to the stem anyway by adding a bit of terracotta in the area of transition between the darker values and the lighter greens that happen closer to the light source. Of course, we'll use this color a little bit heavily at the top portion of the stem. Now, to make the light source on the right side a bit more evident, we'll add a bit of cream here and there, and then, of course, that increases the contrast between the darker shadows and the lighter highlights on the right side. Then we can go back again with the dark umber and add a few of the details and make the contrast even stronger before going over the entire stem with the colorless blender, burnishing those applications. All right, now let's move on to the sugary part. The most sugary part, of course, which is the frosting. We'll start with an application of the Neocolor 2 water-soluble pastels. And of course, we will activate that with a bit of water. And again, just a small amount of water is used here. Not only does using a small amount of water prevent the paper from buckling, but it also gives us a bit more control with the brush. Then we'll start gradually developing the darker values. We're going to start with 20% warm gray. Of course, again, I'll remind you that I'm using the Prismacolor Premier line of pencils. Then we'll go back with a bit of French gray, which is slightly darker but still very warm, and create some of the darker areas of value. We'll burnish these applications with the colorless blender. Now, even though these areas are white, so to speak, when we look at them, the local color, of course, would be white. There are subtle changes of value that happen here. So we're going to gradually build up those relationships. In this case, I'm adding a bit of white here on the upper portion of this top portion of the frosting. And we're going to add some of those white applications on the left side as well, because remember, we're working with two light sources. There's one from the left and one from the right. We can strengthen the highlights a bit further by applying the Neocolor 2 over the top of the colored pencil applications. You'll notice that the Neocolor 2 applications are much stronger than the applications made with the Prismacolor pencils alone. Then lastly, we'll add just a touch of cream to add a little bit more depth to the color. Then we'll repeat the process on the lower portion of the frosting. Again, starting with that 20% warm gray, developing some of the darker areas and tiny little subtle recesses that happen with the French gray. We'll burnish these applications again using the colorless blender. Of course, that's going to smooth the transitions of color and value, but also work the texture into the tooth of the paper a bit, smoothing that texture so it looks a little bit more creamy like frosting. And then again, we'll go through the process of pushing that value relationship by adding white in areas on the upper portion of the lower portion of the frosting on the right and the left side, burnishing those applications as we go. And then lastly, we'll add just a bit of cream there to add a little bit more depth to the color as well. And then we can strengthen some of the highlights a bit further with the Neocolor 2. Working our way down now, we'll address the cake portion of the cupcake. And again, we'll start with the Neocolor 2, this time applying a brown, and then activating it again with a small amount of water, just so that we've got an application where the color is fairly solid on the surface. We'll start by addressing some of the middle to light values with cream all the way across, creating textural marks that resemble that what you would find in a cake on a cupcake, or the cake section of the cupcake. We'll add a few areas of terracotta before going back with the dark umber to start pushing some of the darker values. We'll add a few specks of darker values in the middle portion of the cake, and we'll add some darker values, of course, underneath the frosting where we have an area of cast shadow, and just above the paper that the cake is in, which we'll address in a moment. In this case, the strongest area of shadow happens about 3/4 of the way from the right side towards the left portion. And we're going to make more of the darker values exist in this area so it appears more like the section is rounded. Then, of course, as we make these applications, we'll go back with the colorless blender and work those applications into the tooth or texture of the paper. We can go back and address some of the lighter values with a few touches of white, and then make some of those darker values a bit darker using the dark umber. A few last touches are made with the colorless blender, and then it's time to turn our attention to the paper that's holding the cupcake. We'll again address this area initially using the brown Neocolor 2. Then before activating this time, we're going to use the black, and we're going to create all of those little ridges that happen in the paper. Of course, we're going to be focusing in on the shadowed areas. Now, because the cupcake is, of course, round, they're going to be more concentrated on the left side and the right side, and a little bit more spread out closer towards the middle. Then we'll start the process of activating these applications with just a touch of water on the brush. And we're very careful here to preserve areas of lighter value. We want to be careful that we don't activate everything on the surface and create a muddied look. So we're activating the darker areas first with long vertical strokes and then going back and activating the brown sections with long vertical strokes as well. Once this area is dry, we can start to address some of the highlights. We're doing this here with a bit of cream. And of course, these are the areas of the ridges that actually protrude out. And here again, they're going to be closer together, closer to the left side of the cupcake and the right side, and a little bit more spread out as we get closer to the center. Now we'll concentrate on enhancing the darker shadowed areas a bit further, initially with the dark umber. We'll patiently work our way across the paper section before going back with the indigo blue, making again a more natural looking black, more natural looking shadowed area. Then it's time to go over this section with the colorless blender, again working the colored pencil material into the tooth of the paper, creating a smoother, more natural looking appearance and creating smoother transitions between values and colors. Now we'll enhance the areas of highlight with the white. We'll add a strong shadow just underneath the cupcake where it's resting on the table. Now to create a natural looking cast shadow, I'll use just a bit of compressed charcoal and blend that with the blending stop. And now our realistic drawing of a cupcake using colored pencils and Neocolor 2 water-soluble wax pastels is complete. If you enjoyed this tutorial, make sure that you subscribe to the channel or head over to thevirtualinstructor.com. If you want to learn even more, I encourage you to check out our extensive membership program, which includes video courses, weekly live instruction and live lessons, ebooks, and much, much more. Just click on the button in the center of your screen to learn more about our program, or click on the card in the upper right-hand corner. Thank you so much for watching.